The film opens during the funeral of Darren Shan, a young man. Although everyone is shocked to learn that he is still alive, they are all grieved by his death. In fact, he can be seen playing video games inside the coffin. The action then shifts to the past, as Darren describes how wonderful his life had been. His parents were pleased of him since he was well-liked at school, had nice friends, and received good marks. His friendship with Steve, his best buddy from boyhood, was the one drawback to his life. Steve persuades Darren to fail their history lesson one day at school. Then two proceed to the rooftop, where Steve throws a number of light bulbs into the air and smashes them. Then he challenges his friend to follow suit, but at that same moment their history instructor hears the noise coming from the roof. The boys are thus apprehended, and their individual parents are notified. The situation affects Darren the most because his parents had always thought he was a model student. They severely reprimand him, and also put him on the couch for 2 entire months. They also forbade him from maintaining his friendship with Steve, claiming that the latter is a terrible influence. True enough, Steve is a jerk. The following day, while he was making his way to school, Darren told Steve that his parents had asked him to end their friendship. Upon learning this, the latter becomes discouraged and claims that Darren has never advocated for himself. A man inside a passing limousine throws a flyer out, which drops in front of them while they argue. It turns out to be a freak show invitation from a circus. According to the flyer, it only occurs once in 500 years. The guys remember their teacher telling them not to go to the show. Despite the fact that it is illegal, they nevertheless choose to visit the circus. Later that evening, Darren and Steve sneak from their houses and ride their bicycles to the circus. They purchase a ticket at the venue from a being that resembles a dwarf human hiding behind a curtain. When Steve reaches for the money, the creature bites his hand and flees. The boys ignore the peculiar encounter and enter the theater. It has been made clear that the show has drawn viewers from a range of age groups, primarily adults and seniors. Mr. Tall enters the stage. He gives the crowd a sincere thank you before introducing numerous bizarre oddities to them. At first, a wolfman comes and his presence shocks everyone. Mr. Tall sends him towards a woman in the audience, and to everyone's surprise, the wolfman cuts off her hands. But prior to any response, the woman's hand regenerates, and she walks towards the stage as if nothing has occurred. Mr. Tall then introduces her as Korma Limps, another part of the freak show. Next up is Alexander Ribs, a man with no discernible ribs. The third member, Gertha Teeth, has surprising strength in her teeth and can break anything. Promised 2 bellies, her partner can eat anything thanks to his 2 bellies. Even a teeny hole is swallowed and vomited out whole. Then Madame Truska, a stunning freak, summons Darren to the stage and requests his assistance. Madame Truska stuns the audience by growing facial hair in an instant, but after her act, she surprisingly requests that the show be packed up because she senses something prohibited inside of him when she touches his face. Despite what she asked. With Octa, a spider, Larton enters the stage as the following performer. He does a dancing routine that dazzles the audience. Steve notices Larton humming a tune on a musical instrument. He learns about him from a book on vampires and tells Darren that his real name is Vera Hostin. Police and residents of the town, including the boy's history teacher, suddenly interrupt the show. Darren sneaks backstage and snatches Octa as the adults dispute because he is mesmerized by its vibrant appearance. However, while he is about to leave, he is forced to hide when someone enters the room. To his astonishment, Larton shows up beside an elderly man to address the danger posed by the Vampanies, a group of hybrid vampires. Since I have no idea what the heck is going on, I hope you're all taking notes. Steve suddenly bursts in, pleading with them to transform him into a vampire. He claims that the reason he despises his life is that he is alone, but it turns out that Steve is a parentless child whose mother is a drinker. Larton finally caves after much persuasion and decides to taste his blood. When he puts it in his mouth, however, he learns that Steve is a bad person and declines to change the child into a vampire, causing the youngster to storm out in annoyance. Larton doesn't notice his spider is missing for a while before he does. However, Darren panics and bolts before he can check the door. When he gets to the road, the same automobile from before picks him up. It quickly becomes apparent, though, that they picked up the wrong boy. Actually, they were looking for his friend Steve. They then sent Darren to his home, but not before promising to get in touch with him. The following day, in an effort to keep her safe, he brings Octo to school in his bag. Steve recognizes them, though, even before the lesson begins. When he proceeds to play with the spider, he unintentionally drops her to the ground, which gives her time to flee. Instead of attempting to capture the spider, Steve pursues her with the intention of killing her, creating a lot of disturbance in the school's hallways. Many pupils flee in terror, and some even suffer injuries. When Octave thinks this is enough, she bites Steve on the cheek and then runs out the window. The latter is consequently rendered unconscious by the venom and falls to the ground. The next scene shows Darren rushing back to the circus to beg Larton to save his pal. Larton first declines to assist out of fear that a human will discover their existence and cause harm. He eventually consents to give the remedy, but only if Darren works under him as a vampire assistant. As a result, he will have to say goodbye to his loved ones, close friends, and his entire social network. Darren will also have to stop attending classes. In other words, even if Darren is desperately trying to save him, he will have to die. Upon accepting the terms, a friend is given Larton's vampire blood. They hurry to the hospital as soon as possible to save Steve's life. Steve begins to recover after Larton provides the antidote right away, which happily works. The scene then shifts to Darren a few days later, as his body starts to respond to Larton's vampire blood. He begins to want raw meat. One day he also has an extremely alluring yearning to kill and drink his sister's blood. He eventually suppresses his bloodlust, though, and retreats to his room. Larton warns Darren, tells him he needs to leave his house since he is a threat to himself and his family when he is sitting in the corner reading one of his books. Darren doesn't want to leave, but he makes the decision to do so after nearly hurting his sister. He chooses to fake his death since he does not want his parents to worry about him indefinitely. Larton breaks his neck later that evening on the home's rooftop, helping Darren commit the crime. This will give the impression to everyone that he died by accident. Then the picture jumps to the present. All of Darren's friends, teachers, and relatives attend his funeral as he is still conscious inside the casket playing games on his phone. The following evening, Larton excavates the grave and frees Darren from the coffin, but before they can depart, Merlot unexpectedly shows up and ambushes them. Thankfully, Larton fights him off and temporarily subdues him. After the near miss, he brings Darren to the freak show campgrounds, where they run into Rebecca. Steve is grieving over the loss of his friend in the meantime. He isolates himself from society, as a result, become maniacal. One day, when the suffering gets too much, he considers taking his own life. But just as he prepares to do the unimaginable, Mr. Tinney shows there and intervenes. He describes being aware of Steve's miserable life and his voracious interest in all things vampire. Then he gives him the option of becoming a vampanese. It comes out that Tinney and Merlot are vampanese, a different race of vampires from Larton and the others that kill people in order to consume their blood. It is also made clear that vampanese and regular vampires are fierce rivals and have different ideologies. Mr. Tinney reveals something even more unexpected as Steve listens to everything in shock. Steve is enraged by the realization that Darren is alive and content in the other world, something he had always yearned for, and so he takes the offer without giving it much thought. Meanwhile, Darren gradually feels at home among the other freaks in the freak campsite. He begins to train himself and assists others with their responsibilities. Darren decides to phone Steve after looking through some old photos of his past. Before he can, though, Larton shows up, steals Darren's phone from him, and breaks it. Mr. Tinney stops by the free camp that evening to speak with Martin and Mr. Tall about Darren. The youngster apparently possesses unique innate abilities, therefore Mr. Tinney requests that he surrender them. Despite their hostility, a diplomatic Mr. Tall kindly replies, "I'll think about it." After that, Larton tells Darren not to leave the camp because it is no longer secure for him. He then starts training there so that he can manage himself if he ever finds himself in a sticky situation. The youngster initially fails to touch Larton even once, but as his training goes on, his abilities and strength increase. However, Merlot transformed Steve into a vampanese, giving him superhuman abilities. The youngster also gets increasingly malevolent, and his history instructor ends up being his first victim. "I got an FF is for fangs from you." In the meantime, as Darren starts to get hungry, he starts to crave new blood. Larton takes him to a nearby farm and sedates a man there to fix this. He claims that vampires only take people's blood, they never kill them. They went back to the camp because Darren, although being really hungry, could not bring himself to do it. A troop of vicious vampanese suddenly enter the calm campground of the freaks not long after. As the two sides fight viciously, cheers and a great deal of blood are shed. It becomes apparent that the vampanese are looking for Darren, and they do so without delay. The Vampanese attack Darren when Darren and Rebecca are hiding inside a costume room, and a bloody brawl ensues. Fortunately, the brawl is eventually broken up and Darren is saved from probable death due to the timely arrival of Larton, Mr. Tall, and the other freaks. When all is said and done, it is discovered that Rebecca was abducted the following morning by Merlot. Darren decides to go look for her while taking responsibility for the entire affair. Mr. Teeny kidnaps his family in the interim in an effort to trick him. After some time, Darren finds his house deserted when he gets there. Then he finds a flyer for the circus on the table. Larton begins gathering his weapons as he makes the decision to join the battle as well. The following scene shows Darren arriving at the circus where he discovers Rebecca and his family bound and nailed to the wall. He finds it puzzling as well to watch Steve using the Vampanese. Despite this, he attacks his erstwhile best friend without hesitation as Larton shows there and begins fighting with Merlot because Darren hasn't had any blood to drink. In comparison to Steve, he also becomes extremely frail and easily bumps into things. However, as soon as Darren is about to swallow her blood to regain his vitality, Rebecca frees herself. He initially rebels, but once Rebecca reassures him that she will be okay, he starts sucking her blood somewhere else. Even when Larton sustains severe injuries, he summons all of his remaining strength to stab Merlot square in the chest, thereby killing him. Then, as Mr. Teeny stands back and watches, Darren and Steve begin to fight once more. He's had enough, so he makes the decision to step in and stop them. Using his unique abilities, Mr. Tiny revives Merlot by transforming him into a dwarf creature. The two boys are then invited to accompany him. Steve, who is astounded by his strength, complies right away, but Darren does not. Following the confrontation, Larton hypnotizes Darren's family to erase their recent memories. They won't remember the paranormal activities that occurred in front of their eyes if they do this. The film concludes with Darren returning to the camp, where he is warmly greeted and made to feel at home by all of the freaks.